I know this sounds crazy, but hear me out. I wasn't looking for trouble. Hell, I didn't even know what I was getting myself into. It all started when I was scrolling through Reddit late one night, reading about people's deep web experiences. You know, the usual horror stories about hackers and creepy websites that claim to sell human organs. I've always been a little curious about the deep web, but I never thought I'd actually use it for anything serious. That night, though, I was bored out of my mind and my curiosity got the best of me. So, like the dumbass I am, I downloaded Tor and started poking around. At first, it was just as people described it. Endless, shady marketplaces, forums where people traded God knows what, and sketchy chat rooms that made my skin crawl. I should have stopped there. I should have logged off and gone back to wasting time on TikTok or watching stupid cat videos on YouTube. But then I stumbled across this website called Black Glove Logistics. It looked official, almost professional, which was weird considering where I was. It advertised highly paid courier jobs for those who can keep their mouths shut. The pay they offered was insane. The smallest job on there paid $10,000 and the descriptions were vague as hell. Discreet deliveries, strict deadlines, extreme confidentiality required. I didn't think it was real at first. I mean, who the hell pays $10,000 to deliver a package? But then I saw it. A listing for $50,000. $50,000. All I had to do was pick up a package from somewhere in Nevada and deliver it to a location that would be given to me later. The only condition? Absolute secrecy. Oh, and they made it very clear if I screwed up, there would be consequences. I didn't take it seriously at first. I mean, it sounded like something out of a bad Netflix thriller, but $50,000, do you know what that kind of money could do for someone like me? I live in a crappy studio apartment, my car barely starts half the time, and I work a dead-end job delivering pizza for minimum wage. I figured, worst case scenario, it was just some kind of scam, but the thought of that money, it wouldn't leave my head. So, like the reckless idiot I am, I clicked apply. 2 days later, I got an email. Not on my normal account, on the burner email I used to register. It didn't have a sender, just the subject line, "You've been approved." The message was short and to the point. Congratulations. You've been selected for job number 334. You will receive further instructions within 24 hours. Prepare to travel. Your life depends on your discretion. It was creepy as hell, but it also kind of thrilled me. I told myself it was probably just some elaborate prank, like one of those YouTube challenges or something. Still, I decided to play along. What was the harm, right? The next day, I got another email. This one had more details. A location in the middle of the Nevada desert, just outside a tiny town I'd never heard of, and a date and time. I was to arrive at exactly 11 p.m. alone. No weapons, no phones, no questions. Now this is the part where any sane person would have backed out. But I didn't. Something about the whole thing felt real. And the promise of $50,000 was too good to pass up. So I packed a bag, told my friends I was going on a last-minute road trip, and hit the road. The drive to Nevada was uneventful, but the closer I got to the pickup location, the more uneasy I felt. The town near the coordinates wasn't even on Google Maps. It was one of those blink-and-you'll-miss-it kind of places, with a single gas station and a diner that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. I stopped there to grab some food and, honestly, to calm my nerves. The waitress was this older woman with a cigarette hanging from her lips, and when I told her where I was heading, she just stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "Why the hell would you go out there?" she asked, her voice low and gravelly. "Ain't nothing but desert and military bases. People don't come back from places like that." I laughed it off, told her I was just meeting a friend, but her words stuck with me. As I left the diner, I noticed a guy sitting at one of the corner booths watching me. He was wearing a black hoodie, and I couldn't see his face, but something about him gave me the creeps. I got in my car and drove off, but the whole time I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see him following me. The pickup location was even sketchier than I expected. It was down this dirt road that seemed to go on forever, surrounded by nothing but empty desert. I kept thinking about what the waitress had said about people not coming back from places like this. But then I saw it. An unmarked white van parked on the side of the road. Its headlights flashed twice as I pulled up. My heart was racing as I stepped out of the car. A man got out of the van. He was tall and wore a black suit like some kind of government agent. His face was completely blank, like he was trying not to show any emotion. He didn't say a word, just handed me a small black briefcase and an envelope. The briefcase was heavier than I expected, and I couldn't help but wonder what was inside. Drugs? Money? Something worse? The man pointed to the envelope. "Your final instructions are inside," he said, his voice cold and emotionless. "Do not open the briefcase. Do not stop. Do not fail." Before I could ask any questions, he got back in the van and drove off, leaving me alone in the middle of the desert with a mysterious briefcase and a million questions running through my head. When I opened the envelope, I felt my stomach drop. Inside was a single piece of paper with coordinates on it. I typed them into my GPS, and my heart started pounding when I saw where they led. Area 51. You know, the top secret military base that people joke about breaking into to see the aliens. That Area 51. For a second, I thought about turning back, about throwing the briefcase in the desert and pretending this never happened. But then I thought about the $50,000 and about what the guy in the suit had said. Do not fail. Something told me failing wasn't an option. So, with my heart pounding and my hands gripping the wheel like a lifeline, I started driving toward one of the most mysterious and heavily guarded places on Earth. Little did I know, things were about to get a whole lot worse. If you've ever driven through the Nevada desert at night, you know how it feels, like the entire world has disappeared and you're the last person left alive. That's what it felt like as I followed the GPS coordinates, driving down an endless stretch of highway with nothing but darkness on all sides. My headlights barely cut through the blackness, and the only sound was the hum of my engine. The briefcase sat on the passenger seat like a dead weight, and every time I glanced at it, my stomach twisted. What the hell was I doing? I should have turned around. I wanted to turn around, but every time the thought crossed my mind, I heard that man's voice in my head. Do not fail. About an hour into the drive, I started noticing weird things. First, my GPS went completely haywire. 1 second, it showed the coordinates like normal, and the next, it was spinning in circles, glitching out like my phone was on the fritz. Then my radio, something I hadn't even touched, started crackling with static. It wasn't tuned to any station, but every now and then I swore I could hear faint voices coming through, like someone was whispering just out of range. At one point, I passed a gas station in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't on the GPS, and it looked abandoned. No lights, no cars, just a single rusted sign that creaked in the wind. But as I drove by, I saw movement. Someone was standing in the shadows near the pumps watching me. I couldn't see their face, just the silhouette of a tall figure, completely still. I pressed the gas and didn't look back. About 30 minutes later, I saw the first checkpoint. If you've ever Googled Area 51, you've probably seen pictures of it. A metal gate with warning signs plastered everywhere. No trespassing, use of deadly force authorized. I expected guards, cameras, maybe even a patrol car. But when I got there, the gate was wide open. No guards, no vehicles, just a pair of tire tracks in the dirt leading deeper into the base. I pulled up and stopped, my heart hammering. in my chest. This couldn't be right. Area 51 is one of the most secure places on Earth. There's no way they'd just leave the gate open. But the GPS coordinates were clear, and the briefcase felt like it was burning a hole in my passenger seat. I told myself it was probably some kind of setup, maybe even part of the job, and drove through. The deeper I went, the weirder things got. At first, it looked like a normal military base, long, empty roads, chain-link fences, and the occasional concrete bunker. But then I started seeing things that didn't make sense. There were old buildings with their windows smashed in, like they hadn't been used in decades. I passed a parking lot full of cars, but they were all covered in dust and rusted out, like they'd been sitting there for years. The whole place felt abandoned, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At one point, I stopped to get my bearings. I was about to pull up my GPS when I noticed something in the distance, an old-school payphone just sitting there on the side of the road. No booth, no buildings nearby, just the phone on a pole, like it had been dropped there by mistake. And it was ringing. I swear to God, I almost left right then and there. Everything in me was screaming to get the hell out of there. But against my better judgment, I got out of the car and walked toward the phone. The ringing was loud, almost deafening in the silence of the desert. When I picked it up, there was a long pause and then a voice, a man's voice, low and distorted, like it was coming through an old tape recorder. "You're late," he said. I froze. "What?" "The delivery," he said, his voice sharp now. "You're late. Keep driving. You'll see the lights." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I got back in the car, shaking so hard I could barely turn the key. The briefcase was still sitting there, untouched, but it felt heavier than ever. I didn't know who that man was or how he knew I was there, but one thing was clear. I wasn't in control of this situation anymore, if I ever had been. I kept driving, and sure enough, after about 10 minutes, I saw the lights. At first, I thought it was another checkpoint, bright floodlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating a massive hangar in the distance. But as I got closer, I realized something was off. The lights weren't steady, they flickered, almost like they were pulsing. And the closer I got, the more my car started acting up. The radio turned on by itself, blasting static so loud it hurt my ears. My headlights dimmed, then shut off completely. Even my engine started to sputter like it was struggling to keep going. When I finally reached the hangar, my car died completely. The engine shut off, the lights went out, and no matter how many times I turned the key, it wouldn't start. I sat there for a minute, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm myself down. The hangar loomed in front of me, massive and silent, with its doors slightly open, just enough for me to slip through. I didn't want to go in, but what choice did I have? The briefcase wasn't going to deliver itself. Inside, it was pitch black. The only light came from a single overhead bulb, flickering weakly in the center of the room. The air was cold, freezing actually, and it smelled like metal and ozone, like the aftermath of a lightning strike. The floor was covered in dust, but there were fresh footprints leading deeper into the hangar. I followed them, my hands shaking as I clutched the briefcase. The footprints led to a metal table in the middle of the room where a man was sitting. He was wearing a military uniform, but it looked wrong. The patches were faded, the buttons were tarnished, and the whole thing looked like it hadn't been worn in decades. His face was pale and gaunt, like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. And when he looked up at me, his eyes were completely black. No whites, no pupils, just endless darkness. "You're here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Good." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. I just nodded and placed the briefcase on the table. "Did you look inside?" he asked. I shook my head. I hadn't, though not for lack of curiosity. "Smart," he said. "That's why you're still alive." Before I could ask what he meant, the lights flickered, and suddenly there were more people in the room. I don't know where they came from. They weren't there a second ago. They were all wearing the same faded uniforms, all with the same pale faces and black eyes. They stood in a circle around me, completely silent, their expressions blank. The man at the table opened the briefcase, and for a split second, I saw what was inside. It wasn't money or drugs or anything I expected. It was glowing. A soft, green light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. The man smiled, his teeth sharp and unnaturally white, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in my car, parked at the edge of the desert. The briefcase was gone, and so was my phone. But on the dashboard, there was a small envelope with my name on it. Inside was a single piece of paper with one word written in blood-red ink: run. I don't remember how long I sat in the car, staring at that single word, run. My brain couldn't process it. My body couldn't move. It was like I was frozen, stuck in that moment, replaying everything that had just happened. The man with the black eyes, the glowing thing in the briefcase, the people who appeared out of nowhere, all of it felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. And then I heard it, the low, guttural hum of an engine in the distance. I snapped out of my daze and looked in my rear-view mirror. At first, I didn't see anything. Just the endless expanse of desert behind me, stretching out into the darkness. But then the lights appeared, two bright white beams cutting through the blackness, growing closer and closer. Whoever it was, they were coming fast, too fast. My car still wasn't starting. I turned the key again and again, silently begging it to roar back to life, but it was no use. The engine sputtered weakly, but it wouldn't turn over. The headlights in the distance were getting brighter now, and I could hear the engine growing louder, a deep, angry roar that sent shivers down my spine. I grabbed the envelope and shoved it into my pocket, then threw open the door and ran. I didn't know where I was going. There was nothing out there but open desert, but I knew I had to get as far away from my car as possible. My boots crunched against the gravel as I sprinted into the darkness, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, the engine roared louder, and I could hear tires skidding to a stop. Then I heard the voices. At first, I thought it was the wind, a faint whisper cutting through the stillness of the night. But as I kept running, the whispers grew louder, sharper, until I could make out words. They weren't speaking English, hell, I don't think it was any language I'd ever heard. It was guttural and harsh, like a mix of growls and hisses, and it made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I glanced over my shoulder and saw them. There were 3 figures standing near my car, their faces hidden in the shadows. They were tall, impossibly tall, and their movements were wrong, almost mechanical, like marionettes being controlled by invisible strings. One of them bent down and sniffed the air like an animal, then turned its head sharply in my direction. They saw me. They saw... I don't know how long I ran. The desert seemed endless, stretching out in every direction with no landmarks, no signs of civilization. The moon was the only light, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. My legs were burning. My lungs felt like they were going to explode, but I couldn't stop. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear them behind me, those strange, mechanical footsteps crunching against the gravel, getting closer and closer. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw something in the distance. At first, I thought it was a mirage, a flicker of light on the horizon, but as I got closer, I realized it was real. A gas station, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the darkness. It looked abandoned, just like the one I'd passed earlier, but at that moment, it didn't matter. It was shelter, a place to hide. I stumbled inside, the door creaking loudly as I pushed it open. The interior was just as dilapidated as the outside, Empty shelves, broken glass, and a layer of dust covering everything. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been touched in years. But the lights were on, flickering weakly, and there was a faint hum of electricity coming from somewhere in the back. I crouched behind the counter, trying to catch my breath, and pulled out my phone. Of course, there was no signal. I tried dialing 911 anyway, but all I got was static. The whispers were still there, faint and distant, like they were coming from somewhere deep inside the phone. I threw it down in frustration and peeked over the counter. The gas station was silent. Too silent. I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore, but I knew they were out there. I could feel it, like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. I grabbed a broken piece of wood from the floor, a makeshift weapon, though I doubted it would do much good, and waited. Then the door creaked open. At first, I didn't see anything. The door swung open slowly, the hinges groaning, but there was no one there. Just the empty desert beyond, bathed in pale moonlight. I tightened my grip on the piece of wood, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. For a moment, everything was still, and then I saw it. A hand, pale and skeletal, reached around the edge of the door. Its fingers were impossibly long, curling around the frame like a spider's legs. My breath caught in my throat as the rest of it stepped into view. It wasn't human. I don't even know if I can call it a creature. It was tall and gaunt, its skin stretched tight over its bones. Its face was blank, featureless like a mannequin, but its head twitched and jerked as if it was trying to look at me. And its eyes, black and empty, just like the man at the hangar. It stepped inside, its movements jerky and unnatural, and sniffed the air. Then it turned its head sharply toward the counter, and I realized with a sickening jolt that it knew I was there. I don't remember making the decision to run. 1 second, I was crouched behind the counter, and the next, I was sprinting toward the back of the gas station, my legs moving on pure instinct. I could hear it behind me, its footsteps heavy and deliberate, and that guttural whispering growing louder and louder. I burst through a door at the back of the store and found myself in a small storage room. There was a window, cracked but intact, and I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a metal shelf, slammed it against the glass, and crawled through. The glass sliced into my arms and legs, but I didn't care. I hit the ground running, the whispers still echoing in my ears. The desert stretched out in front of me again, endless and empty, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it catch me. I don't know how long I ran before I saw the car. It was an old pickup truck, parked on the side of the road with its engine running. A man was standing next to it, smoking a cigarette, and for a moment I thought it was another trap. But he looked normal, worn jeans, a flannel shirt, a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He saw me running and waved me over. "Hey," he called. "You okay, kid?" I didn't even answer. I just ran to the truck and threw myself into the passenger seat, slamming the door behind me. "Drive," I gasped. "Just go." "Please." The man stared at me for a second, his cigarette hanging from his lips, then shrugged and climbed into the driver's seat. "All right," he said, shifting into gear. "Whatever you say." As the truck pulled away, I glanced out the back window. The gas station was just a speck in the distance now, but I could still see the creature standing in the doorway, watching us. Its head twitched once, then it stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. We drove in silence for a while, the man occasionally glancing at me like he wanted to say something but couldn't figure out what. Finally, he asked, "You in some kind of trouble?" I didn't answer. I didn't even know how to begin explaining what had just happened. All I could think about was the word on that piece of paper, burned into my brain like a brand. Run. And as we drove further into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't running away from something anymore. I was running toward it. The guy driving the truck wasn't exactly chatty, which I was grateful for because I was still trying to piece together what had just happened. The truck rumbled along the cracked desert road, the headlights slicing through the darkness. I could feel my heart still pounding in my chest, adrenaline refusing to let go of me. Every now and then, the driver glanced over at me, probably trying to figure out if I was some kind of lunatic or just another lost idiot. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he finally said, his voice gruff, but not unkind. "Something like that," I muttered, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. I didn't know how much I could tell him, or if I should tell him anything at all. How do you explain to someone that you're being hunted by things that shouldn't exist? Creatures with blank faces and black eyes that seem to follow you no matter where you go? Yeah, that conversation wasn't happening. For a while, the only sound was the low hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the old truck's suspension. I tried to relax, to convince myself that I was safe, but every time I glanced out the window, I felt like something was watching me. The desert seemed alive, the shadows shifting and stretching in ways that didn't make sense. The driver lit another cigarette, the flame from his lighter briefly illuminating his face. He looked older than I'd thought, with deep lines etched into his skin and a haunted look in his eyes. "You got a name?" he asked, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Jake," I said. It wasn't my real name, but I figured it was better to keep things vague. "All right, Jake. You want to tell me where you're headed, or am I just driving until we run out of gas?" I hesitated. I hadn't thought that far ahead. The GPS coordinates I'd been following were useless now, and I sure as hell wasn't going back to my car or that gas station. "Just away from here," I said finally. "As far as you can take me?" The driver nodded like that was good enough for him and kept his eyes on the road. But then he said something that made my blood run cold. "You ever hear about the disappearing road?" I turned to look at him. "What?" He took another drag of his cigarette, the tip glowing orange in the dark. "Out here in the desert, there's this stretch of road people talk about where folks go missing. They call it the disappearing road. No one knows where it is exactly, but once you're on it, you don't come back." I didn't respond. My mouth had gone dry, and I could feel the weight of his words settling over me like a heavy blanket. I didn't believe in urban legends, or at least I hadn't until tonight. But something about the way he said it, so casually, like it was just another fact of life, sent a chill down my spine. The truck hit a bump, and I grabbed the dashboard to steady myself. The headlights flickered for a second, and when they came back on, I swear the road looked different. The pavement was cracked and uneven, and the desert on either side seemed darker, more oppressive. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew something was wrong. We drove for what felt like hours, the landscape around us blurring into an endless void. I couldn't tell if we were making progress or just driving in circles. My phone was still useless. No signal, no GPS, nothing. I thought about asking the driver to stop, but the idea of being stranded in the middle of the desert was even worse than whatever was out there chasing me. And then, without warning, the truck started to sputter. "Oh, hell," the driver muttered, slamming his hand against the steering wheel. The engine coughed and groaned, and the truck began to slow down. "I just filled this damn thing up," he said, more to himself than to me. Panic surged in my chest as the truck rolled to a stop. The headlights dimmed, and we were plunged into near total darkness. The only sound was the faint ticking of the engine cooling down and the wind whispering through the desert. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like a spotlight had been turned on me. The driver opened his door and climbed out, muttering curses under his breath. "Stay here," he said, grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment. "I'll check under the hood." I nodded, even though I had no intention of staying in the truck if something went wrong. I watched as he popped the hood and leaned over the engine, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. For a few minutes, everything was quiet. Too quiet. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow moving across the desert, just outside the reach of the flashlight's beam. But as I squinted, I realized it wasn't a shadow. It was a figure, tall and thin, standing perfectly still about 50 feet away. My heart started pounding as I leaned forward, trying to make out its features, but it was too dark. All I could see was the faint outline of its body, and those eyes, black and empty, staring straight at me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Hey!" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "There's someone out there!" The driver didn't hear me. He was too busy fiddling with the engine, cursing under his breath. I reached for the door handle, my hand shaking, but before I could open it, the figure moved. It didn't walk, it didn't run, it just shifted, like it had skipped forward in time. 1 second it was 50 feet away, and the next it was only 30. My heart felt like it was going to explode as I fumbled with the door, my fingers slipping on the handle. "Hey!" I shouted this time, my voice cracking. "We need to go now!" The driver finally looked up, his flashlight swinging toward me. "What the hell are you yelling about?" And then he saw it. The figure. His flashlight beam landed on it, and for a split second, I thought I saw his face go pale. He dropped the light, and it hit the ground with a dull thunk, the beam now pointing up at the truck's undercarriage. "Get in the truck," he said, his voice low and tight. "Now." I didn't need to be told twice. I scrambled back into the truck and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. The driver followed a second later, yanking his door shut and turning the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered weakly, but it wouldn't start. "Come on," he muttered, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "Come on, you piece of—" Before he could finish, the figure was at the window. It didn't knock. It didn't try to open the door. It just stood there, its face inches from the glass. I say face, but there was nothing there, just smooth, featureless skin stretched over a skull, its head tilted slightly like it was studying us, and then it raised one of its long, spindly hands and pressed it against the window. The glass began to crack, spiderwebbing out from where its fingers touched. "Drive!" I screamed. "Just go!" The driver slammed his foot on the gas, and somehow the engine roared to life. The truck lurched forward, throwing me back against the seat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching us as we sped away. But I knew it wasn't over, because when I glanced in the side mirror, I saw more of them, dozens of them, standing in the darkness, their black eyes glowing faintly in the night. And they were following us. We drove like hell. The truck bounced and skidded on the cracked desert road, the old suspension groaning under the strain. The headlights barely lit the way ahead, but it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was getting away. Away from those things, away from this cursed road, away from whatever nightmare I'd stumbled into. My hands gripped the door handle so tightly I thought it might break off. "Are they still there?" the driver barked, his voice ragged. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. I glanced in the side mirror, and my stomach dropped. They were still following us. At least a dozen of them, their movements unnatural and jerky, like they were being pulled forward by invisible strings. The truck's taillights cast long shadows over their featureless faces, and their black eyes, God, their eyes, seemed to burn into me, even from a distance. "They're still coming!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Faster! You have to go faster!" "This old piece of junk can't go any faster," the driver snapped, slamming his foot on the gas pedal. The engine roared, the truck lurching forward, but it wasn't enough. They were gaining on us, closing the gap with every second. And then the road started to change. At first I thought it was my imagination, but as I stared out the windshield, I realized the pavement was warping. It looked like it was melting, twisting and stretching in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The lines on the road curved and spiraled, disappearing into the sand, and the horizon seemed to ripple like a mirage. The truck shuddered violently, the steering wheel jerking in the driver's hands. "What the hell is happening?" he shouted, his knuckles white as he fought to keep the truck on the road. "I don't know," I screamed back. "Just keep driving." But the road didn't want us to. The truck hit a patch of shifting pavement, and suddenly we were spinning, the tires skidding as the vehicle fishtailed wildly. The driver cursed, yanking the wheel, but it was no use. The truck slammed into a ditch and came to a bone-jarring stop. For a moment everything was silent. The engine sputtered, then died. Dust filled the air, swirling in the faint glow of the headlights. I coughed, my chest aching, and turned to the driver. He was slumped against the steering wheel, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead. "Hey!" I said, shaking his shoulder. "Wake up! We have to go!" He groaned, his eyes fluttering open. What happened?" "They're coming," I said, my voice trembling. "We have to move, now!" I grabbed the door handle and shoved it open, stumbling out into the cool desert air. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to move, to grab the driver and haul him out of the truck. He was heavier than I expected, and every second felt like an eternity. I could hear them now, their footsteps crunching against the gravel, the faint, guttural whispers growing louder. We barely made it a few feet from the truck before they appeared. They emerged from the shadows like wraiths, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they knew we had nowhere to go. I counted at least 10 of them, their pale, featureless faces illuminated by the faint glow of the truck's headlights. They formed a circle around us, cutting off any chance of escape. "Stay behind me," the driver muttered, his voice shaky. He grabbed a tire iron from the truck and held it like a weapon, though we both knew it wouldn't do much good. The creatures didn't attack, they just stood there, watching us, studying us. The whispers grew louder, echoing in my head like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. I clutched my head, the sound unbearable, and fell to my knees. "Stop!" I screamed. "Just stop!" And then, as if they'd heard me, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. I opened my eyes and saw one of the creatures step forward. It was taller than the others, its movements more fluid, almost human. It reached out a long, spindly hand, pointing at me. I didn't understand at first, but then I saw it, the envelope. It had fallen out of my pocket when I hit the ground, and now it lay in the dirt, the word "run" still scrawled across it in blood-red ink. The creature bent down and picked up the envelope. Its head tilted slightly as if it was reading the word, and then it turned its black, empty eyes on me. For the first time it spoke. "You were warned." The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even a voice, really. It was like a thought being forced into my head, cold and alien. The creature straightened, holding the envelope, and gestured to the others. They stepped forward, closing the circle around us. "Wait!" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. "I did what you asked. I delivered the package. I didn't fail." The tall creature tilted its head again, almost like it was considering my words. Then it pointed to the driver. "He does not belong." Before I could react, one of the creatures lunged at the driver. He swung the tire iron, but it was useless. The creature grabbed him by the throat and lifted him off the ground, its fingers digging into his skin. He screamed, a raw, blood-curdling sound, and then there was a sickening crack. His body went limp, and the creature dropped him to the ground like a broken doll. "No!" I screamed, scrambling to my feet. "Why are you doing this?" The tall creature didn't answer. It stepped closer, its face inches from mine, and I felt a cold, unnatural pressure in my chest, like it was reaching inside me. My vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I was going to die. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The creatures turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness one by one. The whispers faded, the air grew still, and I was alone. I don't remember how I got out of the desert. I wandered for what felt like hours, maybe days, until I stumbled onto a highway and flagged down a passing car. The driver took me to a hospital, but I didn't stay long. The doctors couldn't explain what had happened to me, and I didn't want to answer their questions. I tried to move on, but I can't. Not really. The memories won't leave me, and neither will the feeling that I'm still being watched. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers again, faint and distant, just outside the edge of my hearing. And when I close my eyes, I see them, those pale, featureless faces and black, empty eyes. I still don't know what was in the briefcase or why they let me live. But I know one thing for sure. I wasn't supposed to survive. And whatever I delivered that night, it's still out there. Waiting, watching, and I don't think it's done with me yet.